and I'll give everyone about 10, 15 seconds to start trickling in, or rather get settled in, get a good beverage with you, because I know that we're going to be having a treat of a webinar this month. I was just telling Kathy, I love history, and I'm really, really excited to learn more about the movement, the cooperative movement. All right. Hey, Sisad, how are you?
Oh, yes. Good. How are you?
Good, good. All right. I feel like we're good. I think we're settled. All right, everyone. So I would love to get started. I'll go ahead and start by introducing our wonderful facilitator this month. She is going to be presenting on the history of the cooperatives, and she's got a neat slideshow for us to take all the good information and learn more about the movement. So I'll start by saying that Kathy Statz is an outreach specialist for the International Center for Cooperative Management at St. Mary's University. She also supports NCBA, CLUSA, and the Cooperative Development Foundation on projects including cooperative leaders and scholars. A supporter of youth cooperative education, she spent 30 years directing co-op summer camps and education programs for the Farmers Union and contributes to serve as co-coordinator of the National Farmers Union College Conference on Cooperatives. Her board service includes the Ralph K. Morris Foundation and Association of Cooperative Educators and membership in the Cooperative Communicators Association, Cooperation Works, and Rotary. So with that said, Kathy, I'll turn it over to you and we'll let you get started.
Okay, fantastic. I'm really happy to be here. It's been a pleasure to get to know a little bit through the last couple of conferences, and also just really excited to be able to share what is, just going to be a snapshot of some really tremendous history and the ways in which we in the cooperative space can think about drawing on some of that history, some of that background, and also use it to help project us forward, to sort of galvanize us to greater engagement in the space. So I'm going to bring up my slideshow here and get started. And we want to certainly offer the opportunity for folks to ask maybe clarifying questions if there's something they're not quite sure they understand, or if I gloss over an acronym and forget to describe it or explain it. But we'll sort of try to save some time for maybe more discussion and conversation at the end of our time today. So our topic here is, thinking about the past, also looking to the future, and this context of sort of history and peace in cooperatives. So by way of a agenda today, just kind of run us through our thoughts here is a little bit of an icebreaker, a little bit more self-introduction, some notions of learning about the past, some co-op champions, and a little bit of context for the larger co-op ecosystem of which credit unions are a part, and then kind of looking to the future, right? Thinking about the International Cooperative Year that happened last year, and then the upcoming events, including International Day of Cooperatives and International Credit Union Day. And by the way, October is National Co-op Month for all co-ops across various sectors, and then a little bit of time for wrap up. So one of the things I want to just that I often sort of start with is like, what do you think of when you hear the term cooperative? And that is to say a cooperative business. So if folks want to in the chat, maybe just take a moment and kind of what's that first thing you think of, or what's an example of a cooperative business? And we'll give people just a minute to kind of think about that idea. Sometimes when folks are in credit union spaces, they're really focused on that credit union sector space. And of course, the notion of cooperative business is much, much broader than that. And yet, you can't come in knowing everything all at once. So we're going to look at what maybe kind of comes to people's minds, right? Okay, so it's great. There's a few things coming into the chat now around collective action, community support, shared decision-making, mutual benefits, sharing resources, investing, joining forces, member-owned has come up a couple of times here. Great, and a unified effort. Good, feel free to continue popping things there into the chat around what you think of when you think of the term cooperative. And we'll keep going here with our slides. So a little bit more about my kind of presence in the space here, my entry point, if you will. I've got a whole bunch of titles here that are at the bottom of this slide, but I do primarily identify as a cooperative educator in a very broad way. And for me, that journey started really early. I've got a photo on the slide here of me at one of the mini co-op or farmers union meetings. I'm not sure which. My family were dairy farmers in south central Wisconsin, so my parents belonged to a number of co-ops. And to the Farmers Union, the Wisconsin Farmers Union, which is an organization that got started in 1902 around cooperative organizing, as well as sort of civic engagement for farmers to better their situation. And so we've always looked in the Farmers Union environment that I grew up in as co-ops being part of an economic way to address challenges that often is paired with a sort of civic engagement component, right? And if you look throughout cooperative history, you often find that folks maybe started in one and moved to the other, or saw that both were necessary to achieve change, right? So someone may have started in civil rights and then recognized that policy is slow, right? And so to improve people's lives right now, one of the ways to do that was through cooperative organizing, right? To start to influence that economic component while they were sort of slowly grinding through what was the arc of, justice through the political system. Now, and the reverse could also be true. You have folks who maybe started with neighborhood collective mutual aid, right? And then saw the ways in which that was a shorter term, possibly solution but to address some of the larger problems, they needed to use some of the cooperative skills they gained around governance and democracy and consensus building and apply those in sort of civic engagement spaces. And so that's sort of the context that I grew up in and started learning about really early on. The age you see me in this photo here, by going to co-op meetings, I'm holding a mug from which today is the brand of the largest cooperative in the US, CHS, which is then known as Cenex, and attending a co-op summer camp program where I actually started to learn about cooperative principles, the definitions, the values, the way they're structured, and the places they show up in our economy, both locally in Wisconsin, where I'm from, but also across the globe. So that's a little bit more backgrounding to give you a sense of how I come at these questions and ideas of cooperatives. So I grew up in this co-op summer camp program, and then I started running the program straight out of college. I spent then 30 years, basically, if you include my college summers as an employee, but even longer if you include me, and that's me at the summer camp in the bunk bed with my oldest friend, Shanda, going to this summer camp, learning about cooperatives. But then after about 30 years of that work, I moved abroad. Tom and I moved to Poland. My husband is an English teacher. He was teaching in international schools. But I couldn't imagine, not continuing this work in cooperative education. So that's the point at which a couple of years ago, I started doing what I call co-op perambulation. Now, I was an English major as well as a voice performance major. And so I love words and their word origins. And so I took this notion of to perambulate, right, which means to sort of travel in a leisurely fashion. Those of you who've ever been to the UK, you know that in the United Kingdom, they refer to a baby buggy as a perambulator, right? Because you only can walk slowly when you're pushing a baby in a buggy. So that notion of to perambulate means to travel kind of slowly, and then pair that with cooperatives, my love for cooperative education. And so what I've been doing for these last couple of years is a lot of work around education and outreach in the co-op business model, and particularly in building connections in cross-sectoral ways. So that leads us to our time together today. We're going to take a little look at the cross-sectoral and global cooperative space through a little bit of its history and some of its champions, kind of remind ourselves where credit unions fit into that larger ecosystem, to spend a bit of time thinking about cooperatives as actually a tool, not just for peace, but for something known as positive peace. And then hopefully in some of our takeaways to kind of be inspired to explore that larger ecosystem, to look for stories, to think about ways to get engaged, to maybe to partner, maybe to advocate together, and even more, and particularly in the context of some of the events that we celebrate each year to sort of lift up both the credit union movement and the cooperative movement. So we'll take a little time to look at some histories. Now you'll see a variety of faces on this slide, a variety of places represented. And this is just a way of showing that the cooperative history is, in some ways, I sort of joke that if you've met one co-op, you've met one co-op, but there are through lines, right? There are ways in which we have shared moments of cooperative inspiration that have happened again and again and again and again across the country and across the globe. So just to kind of give a quick overview of some of the faces you see here, the sort of individuals you see in the middle, we have Verghese Kurian, who in India was considered sort of the milkman of India, working with farmers in India to pool their milk. Today, Amul is a huge cooperative in India that has all these small Indian farmers, who supply their milk. We have Nanny Helen Burroughs, who was working in New York and Washington, D.C. Sorry, forgive me, I think mostly more Washington, D.C., to bring together largely communities of African American women to create worker co-ops, to create employment for themselves at a time when it was very difficult for women of color, in particular, women, but also women of color, to find gainful employment to support their families. Towards the bottom of the screen, we have Kagawa, who was working in Japan in consumer cooperatives, who sort of pioneered this notion of like food with the farmer's face as a way of kind of connecting consumers to producers and building consumer co-ops. And we've got Raiffeisen, who is associated with the creation of the credit union movement in Germany, who inspired Alphonse and Doramené Desjardins in Quebec, who's worked to develop credit unions, then spread across the U.S. And then in the corner photos, we've got some examples. In the upper right, we've got the Crediafon Co-op, which was a part of the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul in the 1930s. That co-op community, really, it was not just that consumer co-op, but a whole variety of mutual aid, self-help organizations in that neighborhood in St. Paul, which frankly were destroyed when the interstate highway went through, and they selected the Rondo neighborhood as the through point for that interstate highway, destroying that neighborhood and destroying what was a very rich cooperative culture. In the bottom left-hand side, you've got the Kinning Park Cooperative Society in the UK, their women's guild, organized in the late 1800s. Right? In the upper left, you've got Tomas Villanueva, whom I didn't know very well, but who I discovered created a food co-op sort of in parallel with United Farm Workers. And this is a photo from 1967. I think you can see the co-op flower there on the table. So taking that notion again, crossing the sort of civic, and in this case, labor engagement space with the cooperative economic space, and recognizing that even as we were working to get more rights, to help people bargain in those workplaces in the farm worker workspace, that one other way of helping folks make what they could earn last longer, right, was to create a food cooperative so that they could lower, I think they said their food costs were on average about 7%, less expensive than the conventional grocery stores there. But that made a big difference when you didn't have much. Even a small percentage decrease in cost could help your grocery budget go a lot further. And what I think is kind of interesting is if you look then kitty corner in the bottom right corner, you see a photo taken later of the folks who started the co-op in Rochdale, England, that we have a kind of a touch point there of being sort of what many people consider the birthplace of the modern cooperative movement, but which by no means was the earliest co-op, right? But which is notable for a number of elements, which I'll talk about more in a moment. But as you can see, kind of throughout different decades, different parts of the world, this idea of working together through a cooperative system was resonating with all kinds of cultures, all kinds of communities, and a lot of it rooted in much, much older notions of self-help, right? We see that if we look even further back, right? That is, as long as people have been organizing in communities and civilization, people have gotten together to be safe together, to hunt together, to store grain together, right? You saw in ancient Rome some more formal structures like burial societies. You see the guilds in medieval times. You certainly saw examples of mutual aid in lots and lots of cultures around the world. And as folks came then to the US in its present context and were organizing communities, you saw things like the Philadelphia Contribution Ship, which incidentally was is said to be started by Benjamin Franklin, right, in the mid 1700s as a way for people to protect themselves in the case of fire. I mean, think about that. At the time, people held their wealth in their homes. Their homes were made of wood, and they heated those homes with fire. So you've got sort of this situation where people could very quickly lose everything, right, if they had a kitchen fire and their homes burned down. And so this notion of sort of mutual insurance, this is sort of the first example we see in a sort of formal way in the colonies. And then not too long after, we see the Free African Society emerging, also in Philadelphia, perhaps in, sort of influenced by those ideas of mutual self-help and aid that were starting to become more formalized. And this was a way for folks to band together, the folks who were not enslaved or who had escaped enslavement, coming together for mutual aid at a time where even in the North, they may not still have, equal rights and equal access. So interestingly, the Free African Society is credited with actually staying behind during, I think it was a yellow fever epidemic that swept through Philadelphia at a time where most wealthy Philadelphians fled for the countryside and for perceived safety and escape from the disease, that members of the Free African Society stayed behind to nurse the ill, to bury the dead, right, and to help make sure that things, essential groceries and other services were provided to the people who could not and did not have the means to escape. And then, of course, we have the Rochdale Equitable Pioneers Society, which we'll talk about a little bit more as well. So let's take a look at why that was significant. Oops, sorry, hold on here. Oh, no, sorry. Well, before I get to Rochdale, I want to talk a little bit about the emergence of associations and the context there. So we've got as early as 1895, the emergence of an international, a global cooperative association, kind of coming out of the tenets and the principles created in Rochdale. You can see this emergence of kind of the need for an international association to be able to speak on behalf of cooperatives, to help spread the cooperative message across the globe, to share ideas from different countries and cultures. And perhaps, little surprise, knowing that the Philadelphia Contribution Ship had already been around for, over 100 years, you've got a national association emerging in the US around mutual insurance companies, right? That are we don't always think of as being part of the cooperative community, but in fact, globally are lumped in, right, with the cooperative way. In fact, if you look at the top cooperatives in the way that the global cooperative community categorizes them, the very first U.S. co-op that appears on the list is State Farm Insurance, which is a mutual. It's owned by its policyholders, right? We don't often think of that in a cooperative context, but it's sort of the larger global definition. Mutual insurance fits right in as a type. So then we've got in 1916, what's known first, or eventually as the Cooperative League of the USA, today the National Cooperative Business Association, but which incidentally is going to be renaming later this year as U.S. Co-ops, not unlike, the credit union space, which has renamed itself as America's Credit Unions to be a little bit more obvious, for the policymakers and others that they want to spread, their messages around advocacy and education. In 1942, you see, as we come out of the Great Depression, the creation of the National Rural Electric Co-op Association, NRECA. Incidentally, a lot of folks don't realize, but over half the country gets its electric power from a member of the National Rural Electric Co-op Association, from a member-owned, member-governed cooperative of rural and farm people who have these electric cooperatives, frankly, because not unlike in the credit union space, right, the sort of investor-owned model, the banks in the case of the credit unions, but the investor-owned utilities in the case of the rural electrics, right, those larger players in the market simply wouldn't serve certain populations, certain groups, right, certain demographics. They couldn't make money on it, right? So they had no interest in providing services there. And so just as the credit unions came in to sort of meet that need for working people and modest income folks and under-resourced folks, the rural electrics came in to provide electricity to farm and rural people out in places where, again, if you only have a couple of customers for 10 miles of power line, that's not going to generate profits for shareholders. And so those investor-owned utilities had no interest. And the cooperative way emerged as like, oh yeah, we already know how to do some of this around our agricultural marketing, around our credit, systems, around other ways of securing farm supply. Why don't we create our own electric companies? And so you saw the emergence of National Association there, the housing cooperatives, and about another 20 years later, a little bit later on, the National Co-op Grocers. Now, grocery has been around for a long time in the co-op space, but as sort of a reaction to what many people saw as sort of the industrialization of agriculture and some concerns about the purity of food. In the 1970s, natural food co-ops started showing up on the scene. A lot of them started as buying clubs. So again, a bit of a parallel with the credit unions, right? When you think of those early credit unions, it might have been a cardboard box with, locked away in the janitor's closet in the basement of the factory, right? You had these buyers, kind of buyers clubs that were basically buying food in bulk and then in someone's basement or garage, inviting everybody over to divide it up, cut the cheese into smaller pieces, repackage bags of flour, and then sell it to the neighbors and friends. That grocery co-op sort of began to get more professionalized. Places got brick and mortar, just like you did in credit unions. And then by the late 1990s, the observation, like, wow, the other sectors have these national organizations to help them, get even greater buying power or even greater advocacy power. Let's do that in the groceries as well. Right. And then you also began to see it with the worker co-ops. Again, worker co-ops have been around for a really long time, but there was a kind of a reemergence of worker co-ops in the starting around, I don't know, 90s or so, 80s or 90s. People were starting to kind of react to what were sort of challenges in the way employees were being treated in sort of an increasingly capitalist environment. And so, like, how can we create an opportunity to counter that? How might workers actually own the companies themselves and fully democratically govern them? Right. And then, of course, our own national association here with Milk Cup. So this is just to give you a sense of, like, over time, there is a recognition that just as the credit union or the local co-op helps individuals gain greater power, that those systems can keep moving up and into federations and co-ops of co-ops, et cetera. So let's go back to Rochdale now for a moment. I wanted to touch on this a little bit. And this is just, again, lots of co-ops were around before Rochdale. And sometimes in co-op spaces, we have a tendency to simplify and say, Rochdale was the first co-op. Not true. There are a lot of cooperative activities happening, and there were even formal cooperatives happening. But Rochdale was kind of significant in a number of ways. I mean, it was the beneficiary of lots of trial and error and failure, frankly, particularly in Europe and particularly in England at this time. Their founding members were very politically active, as well as interested in changing the way they served themselves into this economic model. But it's these principles, in part, which really sort of cement them as a touchstone moment in our cooperative history for a couple of reasons. One was they weren't the first co-op to touch upon this idea of, rather than just sharing any surplus we have equally with everyone, recognizing that we will maybe always have some what we would call free riders, right, who take advantage of the benefits of the co-op without maybe patronizing it or using it very often, right? They really latched on an idea that had been starting to formulate around that time of, like, wait a minute, what if we link people's benefit to their participation, right? Like, the more you spend or the more business you do with the co-op, if the co-op does well, that's how we'll determine the distribution of that surplus. That was a kind of a new idea, right? And so that idea of becoming a little bit more business centered, right, and not just sort of giving everybody everything because they showed up, right? I mean, and you see this in the credit union tagline that emerged, in the beginning of the next century, that not for profit, not for charity, but for service, right? You see a little bit of that notion that we can't just give everything we have away, or we won't be functioning here as a business in the future. So that element was kind of distinctive about Rochdale. And also, I think personally, as an educator, I love that the promotion of education was there from the very beginning. And that idea that we needed members of co-ops to understand the business, to understand the sort of social and political and economic factors that brought them to that place, and then how they could use the economic and political systems to create some change. In fact, this little store in Rochdale, which still exists as a museum today, they had an upper floor because they rented the building. They had an upper floor that was vacant, right? As the business was small at the beginning. They made that into a library. They got subscriptions to the magazines and the flyers and the newspapers of the day, to share information about what was happening, not only in their local community but in the world, to help their members understand those dynamics. And then some of their members didn't read, so they taught them to read too, so that they could understand those materials that were available to help them create this context, in what they were doing. And then that idea of education also extends out, right, to the general public, to opinion leaders. And that, I think, was a really significant element that, as the principles have evolved, has always been a constant. So that's the next thing I want to just share with folks is, when the ICA, the International Cooperative Alliance, sort of adopted those principles in the late 1930s, they recognized that times will change, right? And the principles may need to change with those times. And so the international cooperative community, about every 30 years, actually sits down and looks at those principles. There's a whole lot of text and actually explanation and fleshing out that goes beyond just the words you see on the screen here, right? There are pages and pages written about, like, what does that really mean? Principle 1, what is that? How do we, operationalize, principle 3? So the international community goes back and looks at those principles about every generation, about every 30 years, and decides if they're still fit for purpose, right? And so what you see in 1966, education is still there, right? And they've added now members and public. So articulating, if you will, it's not just our own members, but actually everybody needs to understand the co-op principles. What does that mean to be a cooperative? And then, right, about 30 years later, you see 1995's version of the principles, a few changes, right? A few differences. For example, if I go back just a moment to the original Rochdale principles, look at principle 6, cash trading, no credit, right? There was this idea that, like, again, we can't just be a charity, right? We may know that one of our members has fallen upon some rough times. Maybe there's been an accident at the factory and they're out of work. But, like, there are other places, the church or other charities, that can fill those short-term needs. If you're going to shop at the co-op, cash is king, right? Right. And that was actually one of the reasons the co-op was successful, is because they were pretty hard-nosed about that fact that they were a business and people had to pay, right, in order for them to have an inventory to serve the members in the future. But, as time changed and credit became more a thing, right, that principle kind of went away, and we brought other principles in to take its place. And so I have here in red, actually, concern for community. Take a look, 1995. We all think of concern for community as being really foundational to who we are in cooperatives, but it wasn't actually articulated as a principle until the mid-1990s, right? So it's just a way of showing, like, all the things that we think are sort of, yeah, this has always been who we are. Maybe it was implicitly so, right? But from time to time, the global community actually sits down and says, what are we really saying, what we want to say with these principles, right? And, right, the principles actually are right now, right? If you're doing your math, you're like, okay, it's about 30 years later. Right now, the international cooperative community is looking at these 7 principles again, right? And they're having a multi-year conversation, collecting information through their member organizations to say, does this still say what we wanted to say? Do we need to make any changes, right? So this is kind of a living, breathing thing, right? The principles. And I encourage you, if you're interested, to look online, or I can follow up with more of that information to learn more about it. So I want to shift gears a little bit and kind of bring us back to that organizational aspect of co-ops. We have this term, in the credit union space, our co-op onions. If you've been through the Development Educator Program, or if you've attended other co-op education conferences and credit unions, you may have learned about this model, this way that we sort of think of the layers, right, of credit unions, that we start with the member as like that core, that basic element. They're a member of their local credit union. Their credit union may be a member of a chapter. The chapter may be a member of a state league. The league is a member of some of these national organizations. And then we have the World Council of Credit Unions sort of at the top, right? But this notion, this stacking, if you will, exists in all the other sectors as well, perhaps with not always as many layers, right? Because credit unions have been around for a long time and they've got all these layers of these different entities that, provide service. But one of the things that I love about the co-op space generally is that, there's no sort of hard ceiling to these layers, right? As an individual member, right, I could register for the World Council of Credit Unions conference, right, for the World Credit Union Conference. And I have, right? I volunteered there last year and I'm going to volunteer again this year. Like there is nothing barring me from full participation, right? That I think is interesting, right? You don't necessarily have to register through, right, one of these layers in order to participate somewhere else along the line. And what I love is that this onion in the credit union space, right, is part of a sort of three-dimensional figure of all of the other sector organizations out there, right? So a credit union member could also just as easily become a member of the national cooperative business association and participate in its programs and learn from its materials, right, and engage in that space in a variety of ways. That there are sort of these permeable boundaries between and among the various credit union layers that we have. And these are, part of our long history of like having the member, the individual be first, right? And sort of making sure that there's access to the information and the engagement in lots of different ways. And to me, that's such a beautiful way of sort of manifesting, the individual member and their priority in these systems and in these structures. I think that's kind of really cool about credit unions, right? And that if you're not already connected to some of these spaces, to reach out to get to know them. I just noticed that Cassie put in the chat, and some of the scholarship recipients, attending the World Credit Union Conference are in fact members of their credit unions, not employees, right? Not staff. That we have these ways in which members and staff, right, board members, individual members, employees from at every level have these sort of access points. And I think you see that particularly in the credit union space, right, where many credit union leaders talk about having started as a teller at their local credit union, right? And they've risen all the way to the rank of CEO, and they've done it within the credit union system, fostering them all along the way. You see examples like that in the other in the other cooperative sectors as well. People, right? There's a CEO of a large agricultural co-op who started out as a worker in a feed mill, right? And worked their way up in the system. And this is, I think, just really, really cool. So we've got like I said, we've got all kinds of onions, right? And these onions kind of all mix with each other, right? We've got red onions and sweet onions and yellow onions, like, right? We've got all these different organizations that have this kind of ability to cross engage, cross connect. It's just a reminder. Think of all these different sector spaces, right, that are a part of this beautiful co-op ecosystem. And when you're an individual member, right, or an individual staff person, right, like in some ways that might feel overwhelming, but it should also feel really empowering. Like, wow, I'm a part of something really big here, and something that has such a long history with so many beautiful and amazing stories and champions and inspirations for how we move forward in the work. So one of the ways that we sort of sought to inspire the global community is through what happened last year, the International Year of Cooperatives. So this was a United Nations designation, right? This wasn't something that the credit union movement decided. Credit union movement has close ties with the United Nations, and a couple of credit union cooperative sort of system members. I think it was actually, I want to say it was like Myanmar and Kenya or something. I mean, right? It wasn't even sort of the big ones you might associate. Actually reached out to the United Nations and said, we had an International Year of Cooperatives back in 2012. We think it's about time we had one again. Let's do this. And the United Nations said yes. And the whole international community said, okay, right? We didn't have as much lead time as we did in 2012. So it wasn't quite on the radar as much as it could have been, I think, but it happened. And these were sort of the big four tenets that globally the co-op space was seeking to celebrate, right? So let's get greater visibility, public awareness, not just about co-ops, including credit unions, but like also particularly the tie to sustainable development, right? To the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, right? And those of you who've gone through the DE program, you might have learned a little bit about those Sustainable Development Goals. I'll talk about one of them in particular in a little bit. right? So there's that visibility component. There's sort of the growth and development component, right? So many of our co-ops, including credit unions, have been around for a long time. We sort of take them for granted, but co-ops are being founded every day to address new needs, right? To meet new market gaps in places both domestically and internationally, right? Where other players have failed, everyday people in their and for them to be able to achieve their needs and meet their needs and get access to services. So let's keep growing and developing cooperatives, right, in all kinds of ways, and particularly collaboratively across sectors. Number three, advocating for an enabling environment. I mean, I'm from Wisconsin. Wisconsin and Minnesota are Minnesota's number one, Wisconsin's number two, respectively, for the number of co-ops in the country. Part of that was an enabling environment politically, right? Early on, the credit union sort of movements in those states said, let's get this in statute, right? Let's make sure that there's a co-op kind of law, right, that co-ops can incorporate under. There's a statute there that explains exactly what that means to be a cooperative, make it really clear. And having that enabling environment and the consequential supporting legal and policy frameworks, all of that helps to build a stronger cooperative system. There's a kind of a saying like there isn't a co-op statute in every state, but you can create a co-op in every state because sometimes you just go about it a different way. And we've seen this in the credit union space too, right? Where maybe we have to think about different strategies for different audiences, right? Looking at ITIN lending maybe, right? Instead of sort of the way we've always done it to sort of meet the needs where structures don't quite exist or aren't existing in inclusive ways. So making sure that we've got environments where it's clear what a co-op is and then how people can be a part of them and how we can protect them. And then, finally, inspiring young people. I mean, I feel so lucky to have been a part of a very inspiring space as a young person to learn about cooperatives at an early age and to see the impact there, not just for how co-ops were operating in Wisconsin, but how they were helping people across the globe. So what's really exciting for us in co-op land, including credit unions, is that this international year idea was such a success that there is actually a resolution that we shall have an international year of cooperatives every 10 years. This is the only global area that United Nations celebrate that has this designation. Everybody else basically has to fight for it, right? We've got international years of camelids. We've got international years of legumes, right? So like camels and lentils get celebrated once in a while, right? Because they're proponents and they're champions, want to get visibility of them. But co-ops are now enshrined in a decennial, I think is how I say it. Like every 10 years, we'll be returning to this opportunity to celebrate cooperatives globally. So the question I have for audiences now is to say, what will you be able to say 9 years from now you achieved since the last international year, right? How can we be laying some groundwork now for some benchmarks, for some ways we can think about advancing all of these things around building equitable, resilient, and people-centered economies, right, through the cooperative model. And we, of course, include credit unions in that. So that's a little bit of a challenge and an inspiration for you, I hope. So changing gears now, let's look at how this applies in the space going forward, right? We've got, you may not have known this, but we have an International Day of Cooperatives. It happens to be the first Saturday in July. So you know what? In the US, I feel like it doesn't get a ton of visibility because everybody's celebrating Independence Day, or many people are not everybody. Many people are celebrating Independence Day around that first Saturday in July, right? It happens to be usually the time people have for their weekend events, regardless of where the holiday falls. This year, it happens to literally fall on July 4th. But I raise it so that people are aware, right? This is an opportunity for us to sort of celebrate, right? All of the things you see here. What is our capacity for the model? How can we strengthen social cohesion and promote peaceful, we're going to come back to that, peaceful and inclusive societies. And it really should be kind of a collective call. This year, it does have a theme around peace, right? How can we see cooperatives as a way to bridge differences and to create more peaceful societies, right? So the theme for the International Day of Cooperatives is building bridges, cooperative contributions to a peaceful world, right? And I said I would bring back that Sustainable Development Goal, right? The SDG 16 is around peace, justice, and strong institutions. That this is one of the strategies for how we build more sustainable development, right? It's very difficult to do development work. And perhaps I dare say we see that domestically right now as well when things are unstable, right? in, we have people can't focus on creating more effective systems when they're just trying to stay alive, right? Or when they're just trying to feed themselves, when they're just trying to find housing, right? When they're just trying to keep their jobs, right? And of course, in a war-torn environment, right? Even more so. So this is a really, I think, a cool opportunity for us to think about how co-ops play a role, right, in building peace, in helping to create institutions which are strong, right, and where there's justice. So that's a real, I think, interesting space for us to think about that we maybe don't always extend our lens out that far, right, to sort of those global components. So I want to talk a little bit more now about that notion of co-ops and peace. There's a lot to be said around the business model of co-ops actually directly promoting peace, right? And I'm going to add the notion of positive peace, okay? Because sometimes we think of peace as the opposite of war, but there's a notion that positive peace is actually something more, right? It's actually an environment of what in many ways we might consider sort of like well-being, right? Which we know well in the credit union space. We're thinking about financial well-being, but like community well-being has a lot more to it than just the absence of war. So the notion of what are the environmental considerations that actually are moving people positively, not just toward having the absence of war, but moving towards really sustainable and stable society, right? Positive peace. Okay. And in 2009 already, the International Cooperative Alliance was thinking about this, and they passed a resolution because they really wanted to name this, like, what is our commitment to promoting peace, right? Not just in helping to build cooperatives, but actually through cooperatives, building these links, right, between divided people and supporting inclusion and mitigating conflict, right? So there's this larger conversation that has been a part of our story, and it goes way, way back, right? So here's just one example. So in 1933, we have the Cooperative Women's Guild in the UK. And incidentally, the early cooperative movement associated with Rochdale and the cooperative activity that happened in it after its development was very closely tied to the women's suffrage, very closely tied to workers' rights, right? They were not just doing economic work, they were doing political work. Right. And one of the reasons was, they were a grocery store and they recognized early on this co-op in Rochdale and the sort of cooperative food retailing societies that emerged out of it. They're like, who's doing the shopping? It's the women, right? So we better make sure that we're engaging them. And also because it's the right thing to do, right? We have a space where we can actually fully engage everybody in our community, including young people, right? And make sure that there's a space there for them to be a part of this. And so fairly early on, in the wake of the First World War, the Great War, right? The war to end all wars, as it was known at the time. Unfortunately, that we saw that didn't last too long, but there was this idea that because the poppy, and some people may know the red poppy as being sort of a symbol of remembrance that emerged out of the Great War, out of World War I. And they introduced this notion of the white poppy, right? It was not only that we should remember the sacrifice, right? Remember those who died. What are we doing to actually work towards, right? What they probably didn't have the term for at the time, but for positive peace, right? For the absence of war in the future. How do we be sure that we never have to, right, have more red poppy? And I don't know if you know the symbolism of the red poppies in the fields of France and Belgium, in the battlefields, after they were, completely torn up by the carnage of the war. Some of the first things to reemerge on those battlefields were poppies. They grew up in the spaces where the ground had been disturbed. And the symbolism of those red poppies on those bloodied battlefields was so powerful. That's how they became known as the symbol of remembrance. But, the counter to that, and it was the Cooperative Women's Guild that said, you know what? Yes, and what are we doing to make sure that never happens again? So there was a lot of this effort around building peace and doing it, kind of through their sort of demonstrating it through their cooperative work, right? And I think that that's really beautiful. And you see here too in the banner on the left, that rainbow. The rainbow was a symbol for cooperatives long before it was picked up by the LGBTQ plus community, right? That notion, and you still see it in some countries where the rainbow flag is a cooperative flag, because of the notion of inclusivity, And so I think that and maybe sort of the emergence of peace after the storm, right, as well. So that's just a little bit of a sense of like where some of that comes from historically. And then we see it in some of the spaces here in the US. So these are all, booklets and books and comics, cartoons, if you will, that were emerged out of the US cooperative movement. You see this notion of like co-ops as a way to reconstruct, co-ops to build peace, swords into plowshares, this image on the right, sort of contrasting, sort of just money as the sole, be all end all, and the things that fosters. And then the Twin Pines, which was a symbol of cooperatives espoused by James Peter Warbass, whose book, the title of his book there is in the center image, that notion of the Twin Pines as a way to sort of capture a quick symbol for cooperatives, all the things that offered. And you'll notice, right, in addition to lowering living costs, better housing, adequate medical care, enduring peace, right, that was a strong part of the message of cooperatives at that time. Now, I'm going to switch gears for just a moment. It may seem a little startling to introduce this slide, but has anybody ever sent or received a care package? I've got an image of, one of the ones you can buy online that you can send to a college student, get through the finals, here's some sweet treats, here's a little liquid IV, maybe there's some microwave popcorn in there, a little bit of energy snacks, some affirmations, etc. Right? So a lot of us know this term care package is a kind of a pleasant gift that we might give to somebody who's, a shut-in or in college to brighten their day, to give them a little boost. We're not as familiar with the fact that it actually is linked to this grubby little box on the right-hand side, right? These were the first care packages. What does that mean? Well, that word care was actually an acronym. It stood for the Cooperative for American Remittances to Europe. And in the post-war devastation of Europe, when food systems essentially had been destroyed, right warehouses had been converted for the war effort, rail lines in some cases had been bombed and destroyed, agricultural fields had become battlefields, right? The ability for Europe to feed itself in the aftermath of World War II was in question, right? People were like, the war was over, but people were still starving to death. And so in the US, the cooperative community, agricultural businesses, many of whom were cooperatives, right? Faith groups, labor groups, they said, we need to do something about this. And they raised money and basically started a cooperative to take foodstuffs and get them to families, initially directly to families. Like literally when the care program started, they reached out to Americans and said, who do you know in the old country who's hungry right now, right? Do you have a grandparent in Belgium? Do you have an aunt and uncle in France? And can we get a package of food to them, sort of from you, but through us? And very quickly they realized that the need was much greater, and right, and it was like, we just need to get food to people any which way. We need to do food drops in communities. We need to truck in food. We need to airdrop food. Like, we need to do it faster, and we need to do more of it. And so the larger effort became they sort of enlarged the effort, and they just started getting food to people. And right, all those boxes, all of those crates, all those bags were emblazoned with the acronym CARE. That's where the notion of care package comes from. CARE still exists today as a nonprofit organization. It sort of converted after Europe kind of caught up with things, and they still do work around poverty alleviation in other parts of the globe. And so they're sort of like their own entity now. But to get that effort started, one of the largest contributions came from something called the Freedom Fund, which was created by cooperatives. That fund was the beginning of what today is the Cooperative Development Foundation, which is in Washington, D.C., and is the sort of sister entity with the National Cooperative Business Association, right? It's the side-by-side 501c3 entity that does development education work as the national organization does, with advocacy and education and thought leadership work, right? So that was the beginning of CDF. It's tied to CARE. And it's a part of our cooperative story that a lot of folks don't realize, and what I think is really powerful. So this notion of cooperatives and peace, when I think of cooperatives and peace, I always think of Dr. Ian McPherson. He was a lovely, lovely historian and cooperative researcher from British Columbia. He was at the University of British Columbia, University of Victoria in British Columbia. And he was he was so deeply interested in this connection as a historian, right? In this connection between co-ops and peace. And he said, really, in co-ops, we need to think about how often, right, our cooperatives grew out of times of crisis, right? Think about the credit unions coming out of the Great Depression. A lot of the agriculture co-ops also came out of that time, right? Think about, in their own way, the natural food co-ops emerging out of, a time when the trust around the industrialization of food was in question. Right. And today, worker co-ops growing out of increasing instability and advantage taking, right, and wage theft and all of that in the economic situation we have today. So there are all these times, and going further back as well, right? Of course, the Industrial Revolution is sort of what inspires the Rochdale Cooperative that we talked about earlier in its principles. So we have this awareness that these cooperatives emerge out of these really challenging times. And that we should not just see cooperatives through this financial or business lens, but also recognize their social role, right? What is the capacity we have to reach out over differences and bring people together? And Ian said, peace building rather happens in communities, not on battlefields. And it's in this context that cooperatives can make their greatest contribution to building a more peaceful world. So as we, look forward to International Credit Union Day, what does that look like, right? Think about when, and if you have not seen it yet, it's recently been announced the theme for International Credit Union Day on October 15th is cooperative finance, a steady signal in a noisy world. What parallels can we draw there, right? In what ways is noisy and unsteady have its opposite, right? Think about peace and quiet, right? So it's the absence of noise. Think about peaceful waters. That's steady sailing, right? So there are some parallels here that I think are kind of interesting between this notion of our International Cooperatives Day around peace and thinking about how we can be steady in a noisy world. And it just might be a context for you to think about how you celebrate, right? There's lots of definitions of peace. This was an interesting little quote I found here from the Early Childhood Peace Consortium, nothing to do with cooperatives, right? But look at how they define peace, that they're rooted in notions of individual flourishing, cooperation, mutual respect, and justice, right? They go on to say it's one thing for children to be healthy, but an ideal world would foster children who are also peaceful, who have a capacity for empathy, respect, fairness, and trust in relationships. Or how this is so similar to what we see in our cooperative values, right? And sometimes people know the cooperative principles, but they may not be aware that there's a companion element known as the cooperative values. And they're here on the lower part of the screen, right? Self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equity, quality and equity, solidarity. And then these ethical values, right? They add this additional layer around honesty, openness, social responsibility, and caring for others. These are arguably just as important as the principles. And I think you will find as this cooperative global discussion is happening, right, that every 30 years deliberation, what I'm beginning to hear is that there will be an increased emphasis on the values, because for so long we were like, here are the 7 principles, here are our principles. Don't talk as much about the values. And the values might be more than ever what we really need to raise up how cooperatives, right, can be something really different at a time that is increasingly unstable for all. So through our understanding these shared histories, engaging the co-op ecosystem, right, how can co-ops, including credit unions, be this vehicle for peace? How can we create, right, some steadiness, some quiet in this very increasingly noisy and disruptive world? So that's what I have to share with you. Hopefully we've got a few minutes left. If there are some questions, I will stop sharing so that I can see all the beautiful people here and encourage us to have some discussion, or reach out if you've got some curiosities or stories or things you want to share. Oh, and it's so nice to see some familiar faces here today. Thank you for joining. Any big surprises? Some of this cross-sectoral co-op stuff, sometimes folks in the sectors are not aware, the footprint of the rural electrics, the history of care, the connections with these larger movements. I think, the credit union space already feels so rich and so interconnected. And then, you take another step back and realize how connected it is to something even greater. It's really inspiring to me.
I was going to say I didn't know about the care packages. That was really cool. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories because it's a term almost everybody knows, right? But nobody knows its origin, and it's ours, right? It's part of our movement.
Yeah, and I love that it's continuing on. The focus might have shifted, but the
Mhm.
actual need did not. And that's what they recognize, and they continue to serve that.
Yeah,
That was really
absolutely.
cool.
Hmm. I'm a fast talker, so hopefully it was. I always pack a lot in. Those of you who've heard me speak before know, like, oh my gosh, can't believe she actually managed to leave time for questions because usually I'm not so good at that.
Hi, Kathy. I've got a question for
Hi.
you. Do
Hmm.
you perceive or have you noticed credit union shifting from the tagline, not for profit, but for service? It seems
Mm.
like that tagline is slowly going away. I'm not really seeing it as often, or it's not a talking point for a lot of credit union professionals.
Yeah,
So,
that's.
are you
Mhm.
seeing a shift in that or no?
Well, I don't work primarily and exclusively in the credit union space, so I'm a little peripheral to some of it. But I will tell you, I do hear a lot of people instead using the tagline, people helping people, right? Which I love. And I do sometimes invite folks to consider, are the people helping people, are those the same two peoples? Right? Because I grew up in an environment where I was going to the meetings that were the members, right? It was very member focused, the kinds of spaces that I was engaging in as a young person, right? So I really entered the co-op space from a member perspective, right? And I do wonder sometimes if the sense of people helping people is us helping them instead of us empowering each other through the model to help each other. It's a nuance, it's a subtlety, and it's no shame or shade on people who feel great about helping other people, right? But I do wonder sometimes what's the nuance there? Do people really think about who they're talking about at each end of that phrase? And are they the same? And if they're different, there's a place for that too. But if we're really who we are as self-governing, member-led organizations, it probably should be the same people helping each other. And then how do we do that, right? We create systems, we hire professional staff, we create all the structures that allow for that, that enable that support it and sustain it. But at the core, do the members really see themselves as helping each other, helping themselves? So that's a little bit away from your question, but I think it's an interesting one.
Any more questions or anything you'd like to share?
Anybody got plans already for? Yeah, I agree, Richard. It is still a great slogan, and I share it all the time. I'll tell you, I'm giving these kinds of talks to people outside credit unions, right? Because I work in all kinds of sector spaces, and I frequently introduce it as a way of showing, what credit unions are about, like what their organizing notion was. Cassie's got a hand up.
Yeah, I've heard you speak to this a little bit before, so whether it's from you or other examples in the group, but I was just wondering more about relationships that you've seen working well between credit unions and other cooperatives in their area, because I know
Mm.
credit unions can be kind of siloed in what they do, but I also know that there are amazing examples out there that I've heard you talk about before where, they work side by side with other cooperatives to have a greater impact in their community.
Yeah, thanks. I think that that's a really interesting question. One I've been trying to explore a little bit more. I mean, for example, there is a credit union, and it's in New York. Richard, you might remember if it was Brooklyn or the Bronx, that provided a loan to a worker co-op of basically like direct market farmers, right? So there's a kind of they're doing produce, production, but they're doing it through a worker co-op model,
I think
and
it
the
was
credit union provided a loan.
Brooklyn Cooperative.
Thank you. Yeah, it
Brooklyn
was
Cooperative. Yeah.
yeah, Brooklyn Cooperative Federal Credit Union, I think, is
Yeah.
that credit union, right? And there was a great story written about it, right? It really, and like part of the reason for their support was because they literally understood, like, wow, these folks are doing what we did, right? What the way that we were organized, the purpose for which we were organized, they're now doing that in this other way. Let's support that. Many of you may know Brent Rempe, in First Alliance Credit Union in Rochester, and that credit union now has a relationship with an organization called Co North, which is working to help more manufactured housing communities convert to cooperatives, right, where the individuals still own their trailers, right, but in the event of a landlord deciding to sell that park, they organize and actually buy the property and reorganize it as a cooperative that they all share the ownership of together for stability, security, keeps their rents affordable. They can do the things that they always wanted done that the landlord never wanted to do because it would have eaten into its profits. So there's I think some really interesting examples, and I'd love to see more like that where I know not every credit union can do business lending and all that, but like to the extent to which they can, how could they be more actively seeking to support and frankly help capitalize? Because that's one of the challenges with co-ops, right? It's really hard to capitalize when you can't promise power with don't contribution, right? With investment. But how can we help more of these cooperative businesses get started? Co-ops have a much greater, there's some astonishing statistics around how much more sustainable cooperative businesses are than other small business, in part because they have to follow such a long deliberative process to incorporate, right? They're a good bet. They're a safe bet, largely, right? And yet, I don't see as many places where credit unions are sort of actively supporting their creation, or even just knowing enough about them that if somebody comes in with a business idea and is talking about something, doing something really community oriented, that they get steered to learn more about cooperatives. Or if they're thinking about something and starting another nonprofit, and you're like, oh God, that's another thing that's going to need donations and contributions to sustain itself. Could you structure it in an enterprise model, right? Through the cooperative structure. That's the place where I think credit unions could really offer some guidance and support. So Sandra, I see you've got a hand up.
Hi, Kathy. Nice seeing you.
You too.
I do have a question for you. So my question is, I work on the community development, financial education world. So with that being said, so my question is, and hold on, where I had it ready to go, where'd it go? Give me a second, because I had typed it because I didn't want to forget it. So pretty much, how do you see, I'm curious, what role do you see the cooperatives to be playing in addressing financial well-being and economic mobility within the next few years?
Say that again. You cut out just for a moment.
Yeah. What role do you see the cooperatives to playing in addressing financial well-being and economic mobility in the next few years?
Well, cooperatives generally, one of the places I see as real potential, and I know some folks may need to drop off because we're at the top of the hour. Cooperatives generally, I think there's a huge potential for the cooperative model to be used in business succession, right? The worker co-op model, because we got this, the silver tsunami, right? You've got a lot of small business owners that are going to be retiring. And in some cases, they don't have someone with the capacity to buy that business outright. So the alternative might be to simply close it. Another alternative might be for venture capital to pick it up, right? And for it to become part of a chain or a corporate structure. But folks aren't realizing that, like, if you've got a good group of employees that have been with you a long time and they know that business inside and out, you could sell it to them, like all of them, right? Like as many of them as want to buy in. But there's a great example of a veterinary clinic in southeast western Wisconsin that's done that, right? It was a vet clinic owned by a couple of vets. They're getting ready to retire. There are no young vets with the financial wherewithal to buy a practice outright when they come out of vet school with all that debt. So venture capital has been picking up vet clinics left and right because they know those communities still need a vet clinic. So people are going to do business with it regardless, right? And this vet clinic said, what if we sold it to our staff? And they did. So like the vet techs and the receptionist and the accountant, like they're all co-owners of the company now. Like that's a version of the cooperative model that we don't often think about, but could be a tremendous opportunity to retain small business ownership in those communities, right? To give people who've always just been employees a chance to own. And think about how motivated you are to make sure that business is successful now that you're a co-owner. So I think I'm not sure exactly if that's what you're getting at, Sandra, but I think that's one tremendous opportunity space. That again, if credit unions are a part of that economic development conversation in their communities, do they have that in their toolkit to say, this is something that could help you transition, or this is a way that you could gain ownership, right? And I think there's lots of there are examples of, food co-ops that are moving into communities that are where the traditional grocery stores have pulled out, right? And they don't look like the traditional natural foods organic co-ops. They're just straight up grocery stores. They're owned by the local community because corporate grocery pulled out. So I just think that those are lots of ways to stabilize communities. They do require capitalization. right? In the case of the worker co-ops, they might be able to work out a buying out over time. But in the case of building a brick and mortar grocery store, like grocery is a thin margin environment, right? And so those entities are going to need help. So anyway, maybe that gets at a little bit of it, Sandra. I think there's more that we could share, but that's probably the topic for a whole nother webinar.
Well, Kathy, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your passion. I think we can all see it. And everyone who attended, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.
It was a great pleasure. Great to see you all. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.